Gosh, it's just so good to hear birds again. I mean, B-Y-R-D, birds. It's good also to hear about birds. We just love birds. But that's not the same kind of bird. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Cortner, and engineer is Anita Brockington. And we are continuing with our guest, Dr. Robert M. Schoch, talking about the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures and their upcoming film, The Civilization Before Civilization. Find out more at robertschoch.com. But first, most importantly, let's move to Göbekli. I've been pronouncing Göbekli Tepe. I'm in another dimension right now. What is going on? Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Tell us about the discovery of the genuine writing some 12,000 years ago at Göbekli Tepe. Where is the writing found, and what does it say?
Okay, well, this actually ties in with things that we've been talking about before. And I wanted to point out, if I could, two quick things before that, just following up on things we were talking about. The sun, you were asking about stars and consciousness and
Yes,
the
sir.
sun. Well, something that's been found is that hydrogen and protons and electrons can encode information, and that's what we're primarily made out of. That's what stars are made out of.
Mm-hmm.
It's really quite universal, so this seems to all tie together with hydrogen encoding information and our hydrogen combining with that of the stars ultimately. And again, ties in with very ancient beliefs and metaphysical systems. So this ties back to Göbekli Tepe and the writing at Göbekli Tepe. I also wanted to point out that the documentary we're working on is Civilization Before Civilization, and what that's referring to is that earlier cycle of civilization before the current cycle of civilization, separated by Siddha, the solar-induced dark age. So Göbekli Tepe, one of the things that's now I'm convinced of is that there is genuine writing at Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago. To put things into context, the traditional story by the academics, and what I grew up with, and I'm still an academic, I still teach at Boston University, the traditional story that we've believed for so long is that writing, true writing, did not arise until about 3,000 or shortly before 3,000 BC. Göbekli Tepe is 9,700, 10,000, let's just say roughly 10,000 BC. So this is about 7,000 or so years earlier than it was believed writing had occurred. The earliest writing was believed to be hieroglyphics in Egypt. Sumer or Sumeria also had writing. People think of cuneiform or the antecedents to cuneiform, but we're now finding it at Göbekli Tepe. And this was first, actually, I've been working on this with my colleague Manu Safzadeh, who I mentioned earlier in the first hour of the show. He started looking initially at ancient Hittite scripts from the region, and I use that term in a non-technical sense. The more technical term is Luwian and some other terms. But these ancient hieroglyphic scripts used in Anatolia, modern Turkey, in the region of Göbekli Tepe, but dating to thousands of years later. And when you start looking at those, they're not identical, but very similar. Some of the hieroglyphs that were used, say, 1,000, 2,000 BC, to some of the symbols on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe that go back to 10,000 BC. And we started putting this together, and what we're convinced is that some of the writing, and it is genuine writing, at Göbekli Tepe, which you find inscribed systematically on the pillars, was somehow survived or was survived and modified through Siddha. This is my suggestion, survived through Siddha and re-emerged later in very similar form. So the first word that we've translated or interpreted from this is on a beautiful belt that's carved onto one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. If people go to my website and look at the article on writing at Göbekli Tepe, God in the Sun, writing at Göbekli Tepe, they can see this belt. And what it looks like in terms of modern English letters is it looks like a C, the letter C, capital C, then it looks like a capital H, and then a backward C, if you would. And this is not identical, but very similar to the later term that was used for God. And we're convinced that it actually is the word for God on this pillar, which is really interesting that one of the earliest words we can recognize is the word for God. When you look at that in context on the pillar, there's actually more what look like C's and H's, and I'm convinced that what it actually says is that something along the lines, the God of gods, or the supreme God, the supreme entity, the supreme spiritual entity. The H was also used, and we've derived this from analyzing it, the H was also used to refer to a portal or a gateway, so this would suggest that maybe they were thinking in terms of a gateway to the gods or a gateway to the stars. And I say stars specifically and sun because it also turns out when you look at this earliest symbolism, not only is it writing, but it also reflects what we would now call plasma physics. What you will see, and they would have seen in the sky during a major solar outburst. So I believe that they were familiar with what we would now call plasma physics in the sense of what symbols you would see, what types of, it's hard to explain in a quick conversation over the radio, but what you would be aware of during these times. And that they took an interest in the sun, they took an interest in what we would now call, as I said, solar plasma physics. To give a little background here, when you have a major solar outburst, something that happens is you see sort of the equivalent of northern and southern lights, but around the world as the plasma, the charged particles, impact the atmosphere. They will take on shapes in the sky. So you literally see shapes in the sky that look like figures, that look like symbols, that look like dancing human stick figures, that look like human stick figures with birds on their heads. Anthony Peratt at Los Alamos Laboratory, who's a plasma physicist, has developed this quite a bit. He's done a lot of experimental work to show what you would see in the sky during a major plasma discharge, during a major solar outburst. These were recorded as being seen in 1859 during what was a fairly small solar outburst, but people saw these things in the sky. These are reflected on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe and form the basis for what essentially became the earliest writing. Interestingly, they're also reflected on the Rongo script of Easter Island, which is a discovery that Katie made initially, and then we learned from Dr. Peratt and his team that they had discovered it earlier but had never published it. So we put it together. Katie, I want to give her credit for this, put it together independently. So they were recording what they were seeing in the sky during these major solar outbursts. It's interesting that the pillars at Göbekli Tepe predate the final solar outburst that ended the last ice age. So how could they have been recording this if it hadn't happened yet? Well, it had happened earlier. It had there had been smaller solar outbursts or different solar outbursts earlier, including one 1,200 years earlier, which actually threw the Earth into a mini ice age, if you would, or it was already the ice age, threw it into a mini colder spell known as the Younger Dryas. At that time, there was a solar outburst that melted ice dams, which released huge amounts of water into the North Atlantic and shifted climatic patterns and actually sent the Northern Hemisphere into a somewhat colder period for about 1,200 years. Before then, a huge solar outburst snapped us out of the last ice age and warmed the global temperatures at 9,700 BC. So all this starts to tie together, that the ancient people, they were aware of these things. They were aware of what we now would call solar and plasma physics because it was dependent. It was important to them. I think it was more than just curiosity. It was very important to them. They equated the sun, I believe, with the concept of God. Believed that it was, in fact, a conscious entity that could behave in different manners, which I don't think that's untrue at all. And they wrote about it. One thing, I want to mention one last point quickly. The archaeologists, the historians have always said that you need three major things to recognize true civilization. One is writing. I'm now convinced we have evidence of writing carved onto the stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe. I suspect that they had a lot of writing on other perishable materials, just like we have now. Who would think we have writing if you only found a few huge cement, letters? But we know that there's a lot more to it. I think they had a lot more also, and I'm hoping that we'll find more. But we have enough right now to, I think, establish that they were absolutely literate. I don't see how they could have built what they were building if they weren't literate, if they didn't have a way to record and to communicate and to calculate. So we have literacy. Archaeologists have traditionally acknowledged that you need literacy to recognize civilization. They use megalithic structures to recognize advanced civilization. We have incredible megalithic structures. And then the last and third item that's usually asked for by my academic colleagues to prove civilization is that you have cities. And something they still argue is that Göbekli Tepe is not a city. Where are the settlements? Where did the people live? Where did they congregate if they were a true civilization? And my answer, my working hypothesis right now is that we still have a city. It's known as Urfa, or Shanli Urfa, which is very close to Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is about half an hour drive from it. And this is a modern city with hundreds of thousands of people in it. It's a sacred city. Abraham is believed to have lived there. Other prophets in the Judeo-Christian Islam, Abrahamic religions were believed to have populated this city. But what's interesting is when they dig down anywhere to do construction projects, to build a new underground parking lot, to build a new building, urban renewal, they find layers going back to Göbekli Tepe time. People were living there at the time of Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 BC. And in fact, there's a credible statue, life-size statue of a person in the museum at Urfa that dates to the same time period as Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years ago. And when you look at this statue, it is so sophisticated, in my opinion, so modern looking. It looks like a piece of modern art. In fact, it's in the trailer. It's in the trailer that we have for Civilization Before Civilization, so people can see it for themselves.
Well, the carvings on these stones of the fox and so many other animals, they are exquisite.
They are absolutely exquisite.
I mean,
And you're an artist, you know.
Yeah, well, but I just love the smoothness of them and the strength of them at the same time. Oh, but hey, wait a second, we got to pay for the show, or else they'll throw us off the air. So, time out here on 21st Century Radio with our guest, Dr. Robert Schoch. And don't forget Dr. Robert Schoch in the new film in the works called Civilization Before Civilization. Now you know what that means. There were civilizations before any civilization we ever knew before. And without Dr. Robert Schoch, I don't know how much longer it would have taken for us to get to this point. RobertSchoch.com.
Hello, this is Robert Boval. I'm the author of The Orion Mystery and Message of the Sphinx. And you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus as your host. May the quest go on.
And right, Dr. Boval, the quest is going on here on 21st Century Radio. Okay, are you ready?
I'm here.
Robert, you're ready?
I'm here.
Okay, don't be scared now.
Okay.
With all these noises going on here. What does this say about how civilized Göbekli Tepe people were before the end of the last ice age? That was 12,000 years ago.
Oh, I think they were incredibly civilized. I mean, it's hard to, how do you judge how civilized someone is? I think they were incredibly civilized, sophisticated, as we were talking about before the commercial break. The art just has such a finesse to it, such a beauty to it. I think as you're an artist, and you were commenting on that when you look at what's sometimes known as Urfa Man, the statue, the life-size statue I was talking about. And there's just incredible beauty and serenity to him. So I have no doubt that these were not primitive, quote, hunter and gatherers as they've been depicted. And even in the textbooks or National Geographic or in some of the museum dioramas, I fear that they, the status quo doesn't like to change the story or change the story very quickly, so they still make them seem as if these were very primitive people who just somehow magically could construct something like Göbekli Tepe. It just doesn't make sense other than to really give them credit for what they could accomplish and who they must have been. Now, we still don't know a lot about them. One thing I do want to mention is not only do we have writing at Göbekli Tepe, but I am convinced that Göbekli Tepe was, among other things, astronomically aligned to Orion in particular on the equinox, on the vernal equinox. When you look at the alignments of the various pillars, they look out to Orion. It's very interesting that one of the major pillars in what's known as Enclosure D, with the belt that we were describing, well, what is distinctive about Orion in the sky? It is the belt. The belt of Orion is one of the most prominent asterisms, including the nebula that sort of hangs down from the belt, which we see reflected, I believe, in the pillar as a fox pelt loincloth. So you have the belt, you have the loincloth. What is Orion in the sky? It is headless hunter. Basically, when you look at the actual constellation, it's effectively a torso. And that's what we have with the pillars. Now, they could carve heads. You go to the museum in Urfa and look at the artifacts that have been found at Göbekli Tepe, which are now on display, and you'll see beautiful carvings, including of humans and human heads, etc., animal heads. I mean, it's just incredible. We have some of these pictures on my website, and also people might want to look at the Oracle website and the trailer that I mentioned. it's just beyond imagination. 10,000 BC or previously was beyond imagination. I remember talking to archaeologists off the record. I like talking to them off the record, so they'll say things that they truly believe but won't say publicly. And in two different cases, I asked the archaeologists, if you had a sculpture from Göbekli Tepe and you had to date it just on the basis of style and sophistication, but you didn't know anything about it, radiometric dates or anything like that, you just knew it was an old sculpture, how far back do you think it could go? One said 600 BC, another one said 1,000 BC.
Oh, wow.
No one said 10,000 BC, 9,000 years earlier.
Well, that's impossible.
That's impossible. That's what they said. I mean, you can't have something as so sophisticated going back so far, but it exists, and there's no question about the dating of it. I can tell you the dating is good stratigraphically as a geologist. I've looked at all the technical literature, the radiometric dates. I discussed this with the late Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt before his untimely death. He's the one that was in charge of excavating the site until he passed away. He was with the German Archaeological Institute. They're impeccable credentials, meticulous. They would not be off by 9,000 years. So it exists, and it has to be faced. And what's happening right now is that people don't want to face it. When I say people, some of my academic colleagues, they don't want to face the implications of such a sophisticated, advanced site at such an early period in history, before the end of the last ice age.
It kind of reminds me in a way of how the Smithsonian treats when they find or know that there's a giant bones somewhere. They have had some history of diminishing them, taking them out, and putting them somewhere, but we don't see them anymore.
Oh yeah, exactly. I've heard many anecdotal cases of different specimens, should we say, disappearing because they don't fit the story.
That's right. It's got to fit the story. If it doesn't, it's no good.
Exactly.
Who cares if it's true? I mean,
you can't have a bunch of people running around who have spent their life making up one story, and then all of a sudden they're told it's wrong.
You can't do that. It's against the law. But one thing, I've got to ask you a more personal question here, Robert. You know the character Zahi Hawass, don't you?
Oh, I know him. I don't want to say he's a good friend, but I do know him. I haven't honestly seen him in a long time, and I want to say something very positive.
Good.
In person, one-on-one, when no one else is around, he's always been very kind and nice to me. I've actually had dinner with him where there was only just he and I and a mutual friend who unfortunately is now deceased. And, yeah, he was Zahi Hawass, and he told me how great he was, essentially. But, his public versus private, many people can be that way. But anyway, about Zahi Hawass, Dr. Zahi Hawass.
Well, many times that I went to Egypt, we were setting up a sister city relationship with Baltimore City and Luxor. Right. And Sadat supported this. And if it weren't for Sadat at that time, now I did not know that most people in Egypt during this time period that we were going there was hated by many of the Egyptians because of what he was doing with Israel. And we didn't know that. So many times when we went, we saw some very strange things. But Zahi Hawass gave us a difficult time. But then all of a sudden he stopped. And that had a lot to do, I believe, from President Sadat, because we were under his care at that particular times when we went there. Did you ever meet Sadat?
No, I never did. Unfortunately.
Well, the time that we got together, you know the symbol of the pyramid and the eye in a triangle?
Oh, absolutely.
He loves that sign.
Wonderful.
When we got together, he lectured me on the eye in the triangle and the pyramid and the Great Seal of the United States. He didn't know that I did my doctoral thesis on this area.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, he was given a copy of that. because he was trying to find out what this meant. This is how he. No, I better not go into it. What you're doing is far more important than this. But someday you and I can sit around and talk about that. But I was so amazed up at the quality of consciousness of this man.
Oh, I believe it, yeah.
We lost a great soul at that time.
Yeah.
I know there's a paradigm that we'd like to see changed here, but it's going to take some time to do it. What's the best way to do that?
I think the best way to do that, and I say this after, 30 years of this, is just to keep pushing forward, to keep accumulating evidence. And what I'm finding, and this is one of these old truisms, is that what happens is that there are people who will not change their thinking. They'll not change their point of view. They will continue to defend the old paradigm because they have so much vested interest in it. Mm-hmm. They've spent a career in a particular paradigm, a particular worldview. So sometimes, I hate to say you have to give up on it, but you have to give up on those people and just let them retire, let them move on. In some cases they say literally pass away, and I don't mean that in any, negative way, but it's the truth. And then a newer generation comes in who doesn't have the same vested interests. And this is what I'm seeing with my own work. I find that a lot of the newer generation in academia, they're much more open to thinking about certain issues like civilization going back to a very early period, or there being an earlier round of civilization, an earlier cycle of civilization, because they don't have the same personal vested interests that maybe an older generation of scholars had in it. And, it sort of pains me to say this, but so many people think that science should be ideally, and maybe it should be ideally removed from personal vested interests. It should be removed from personal, promotions in academic institutions, etc. But the reality is that people involved in these fields, they have very strong vested interests and very strong emotional interest in things, which is understandable. If you wrote your dissertation on X, Y, or Z, or you wrote 20 papers on it, or wrote 3 books about it, et cetera, or even more, you don't want to see that overthrown. So
that's great. Of course not.
So it's not objective. Maybe science should be objective and just go with the evidence, but in reality, people are not that way. Now, I do try to hold to just sticking with the evidence and wherever the evidence follows. And I've had many people in academia, very well-meaning people, saying that I should have just, gone with the status quo and just made my little tiny contribution to the current paradigm. And
why would they say that?
Well,
Jeez,
because
Robert,
I know.
What are they taking you off the track of it?
Yeah, they say that
because there's a lot of jealousy when you get into creating things that for the first time or something. Because that's. I
think you're right. Jealousy is a big issue. Yeah. There are a lot of people who are jealous. There are actually you pointed out something. I think this is worth pursuing for a few seconds. I think there are a lot of people that if they had thought of it, it would be great. But if someone else thinks of it, it's horrible, and it's pure jealousy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just don't expect it because, you're sitting around, but you're talking about people that are 50, 60, 70 years old. I mean, that's important stuff at that time. But, you mentioned a little bit earlier about God and the sun. Why do you think these people equated God with the sun at
Göbekli Tepe.
Yes, let's get that.
Well,
right.
I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think that they may have actually known something we don't know.
I bet they did.
Most people don't acknowledge that the sun does. We talked about this, and it's hard to talk about this without sounding the wrong way, but evidence that the sun does and stars do have a certain level of consciousness. They do have a level of activity. They do have potentially volition to a certain extent, not like humans. I want to be very careful. It has to be very careful here. But the sun goes through periods of activity. It goes through periods of disequilibrium. At the end of the last ice age, it's going through a cycle like that again. All the indications are. There's actually been papers published in Nature, for instance, in astronomy and astrophysics, etc., by astrophysicists who have pointed out that the sun is becoming incredibly active in the last 70 years, even the last couple of decades, and going through periods of volatility unlike anything we've seen for 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 years, going back potentially to the end of the last ice age. So I think the people back then were seeing that. I also think that they may have realized what we're only learning now, something I mentioned before, that hydrogen particles, small little particles like protons and electrons, can encode information, which is the fundamental basis of consciousness. They may have had some of the insights, even if they expressed it in different ways, that we are just gaining now from certain levels of modern physics, like quantum physics, where it may be consciousness first that comes before anything else and imbues all of matter. Sometimes the term panpsychism is used for essentially all of matter having some level of consciousness and us being part of that. So again, something that Katie and I talk a lot about is that what are we? We are so much hydrogen, or so much protons and electrons, which we can encode information. This has now been demonstrated, and I've looked at the work very carefully, including by Luc I can't say his name now, Montagnier, if I'm probably mispronouncing it, Nobel Prize winning
Frenchman.
Nobel Prize winner, who has done work on how water, which is mostly hydrogen, can encode information, including encoding information as sophisticated as what we have in DNA. And this is just the water itself, not putting any other chemicals in it. There's all kinds of interesting work on how water and the hydrogen in water can form very complex structures that encode information, that the hydrogen itself can encode information, and this is independent of even a quantum level where it starts getting entangled, and we get entangled with a nexus of information. And again, the concept that when we die, a lot of this information survives, and we could call it consciousness survives. There's so much evidence to support that too. This gets into what some people, some of my academics want to dismiss totally, but the field of parapsychology, and that you can have mind independent of physical brain, that there's something more than just the mechanical brain going on, or the neurochemical brain going on. So it gets into a lot of different aspects and a lot of different studies, which are very hard to, summarize briefly.
We're going to take a break here. It's our final break of the evening, and it won't cost anybody anything here on 21st Century Radio with our guest, Dr. Robert Schoch. And when we return, I'm going to see if I can get him to talk about the Great Pyramid a little bit. Okay? Is that okay with you? Yeah. Yes, that's okay.
Hi, this is Stephen Schwartz, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight talking with Bob Hieronimus on one of the most exciting radio programs that I know in the country. 21st Century Radio is really a place where you will get good information from things that matter in your life and that will give you an insight into who you are and why you're here.
You tell them there, Brother Stephen. Oh, I certainly wish I could introduce Dr. Schoch to to Stephen. I really do. Yeah, name is Stephen Schwartz, yes. Okay, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Oh, gosh, Rudy, time is running out. We got about 12 minutes, and we got still a lot to cover. Can we go back to the Paul's Sphinx, Paul, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah, I can't believe it. We've been speaking for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, we should have done a 4-hour show, though. There's a lot more we could do. Okay.
But back to the Sphinx's paws.
Yeah, it's because you discovered in the 90s that there was something possibly under it. Could you tell us more about that? Yeah,
I would not say possibly. I would say based on the seismic work we did in the early 90s, this was with Thomas Göbekli, a geophysicist. We did seismic around the Sphinx, and what that means is that physically, we took a sledgehammer, we pounded on a steel plate. It drives sound waves or energy waves into the rock, which then bounce around, and you pick them back up with what are known as geophones. And you can model things under the Sphinx, what the weathering is under the Sphinx, the rock layers. And what we found is that there is a major chamber or cavity under the left paw of the Sphinx. It's very regular. There's no doubt in my mind at this point that it is an artificial chamber. We also found that there's probably collapsed based on the seismic tunnel, if you would, from that chamber leading back to the rump of the Sphinx and then probably going on beyond into the plateau, maybe up to the second pyramid, which is far west of the Sphinx. And we also found, interestingly, a smaller chamber-type structure, or void, I should call it, under the left rump of the Sphinx. So big one under the left paw, very regular, sort of a passageway or tunnel along the body, and one under the left rump. Now, I mentioned the left rump not because it's very exciting, but because when we did the seismic work, we did not know there was anything there. And it turns out that the Egyptologists already knew about that one because they had entered it. There's, I've since seen it. You can, there's a hole going down to it on the left side that's often covered over with blocks of limestone, but they knew about it. So my point is that we found that seismically without knowing about it. It shows that our data was good. Now, they did not know about the one under the left paw, which is even larger and more regular, and many of them have denied it exists. But how can they deny that one when, in fact, we found the other one that they knew exists?
Yeah, because they're going to deny anything you're doing.
Exactly, right? Because they don't want to hear about it. And then it made it even worse when it turns out that it corresponds effectively to what Edgar Cayce had prophesized or predicted before I was even born. And, they really don't want to hear that has anything to do with a psychic or whatnot.
Yeah, there can't possibly be anyone.
And then to make matters worse, he said it was the Hall of Records of Atlantis. So that really, talk about piling it on
when you
to irritate them.
Just like you said in your book, we have never used the word Atlantis too much, but you knew about it.
No, not at all.
Because
back
if you
then
did,
I wouldn't say the word. Yeah, back then.
You get beat up.
Exactly, beat up. And when did Atlantis, according to Plato, fall, collapse due to torrential rains, among other things, which we had at the last ice age? I wanted to point out when you melted all these glaciers and you had the solar events hitting Earth, you put incredible amounts of moisture into the atmosphere that came down as incredible torrential rains, which we see evidence of geologically, which are also described in much of the ancient literature. You think of the Bible, etc., the flooding, and all this happened, according to Plato, at 9,000 years before his Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, which puts us about 9,600 to 10,000 BC, exactly at the end of the last ice age. This was the same dating that Edgar Cayce gave. So it all sort of ties together.
It sure does.
That's the last thing the standard Egyptologists want to hear.
You're right about that. Curiosity. There are two networks right now, Gaia TV and Curiosity Stream, and both of them have done stories on the Great Pyramid, dealing with especially scanning the pyramids from the standpoint they think they have found very large vacancies, as long as almost the Grand Gallery, almost as long as that. Okay. Oh, then you know about this. Please.
I know about them, yeah.
Yeah, tell us about them then.
Okay, so what they've done is they've used muon scanning. These are particles that come from space, and they pass through almost everything, sort of like X-rays. You can think of X-rays, but they're not X-rays, they're muons. And they use what they call muography. So you set up detectors, and they've set up detectors at various times around and in the Great Pyramid. And what they do is they look at the muons that they collect, and where you have a void, you get a few more muons coming through, because even though most muons, they just go right through the earth or whatever, but when you have big masses of rock, it does attenuate them a little bit, so you get slight discrepancies, and that by looking at those discrepancies, you can see where there is solid rock, you can see where there are voids or cavities, and the data consistently, and I've tried to look at all the raw data I could get get access to, let me put it that way, and I'm convinced that they definitely have good data which indicates that there's some kind of big void or cavity above the Grand Gallery, and it looks like it's about the size of the Grand Gallery, but up above it in what everyone thought previously was just solid blocks of rock. It's not solid rock. The Great Pyramid is built out of blocks of rock, but they thought it was just, lots of blocks of rock up there. No other cavities should be known, according to the classical Egyptologists, much less a cavity that may be on the same size as the Grand Gallery, but above it. So looking at the data, I find it very, very convincing, very compelling that this muography indicates that there's a cavity or chamber, whatever you want to call it, up above the Grand Gallery. And what could it contain? I mean, this is very mysterious and interesting. I'm sure that it must contain something.
Well, they also pointed out about 192 feet up a notch that had something, but they had not figured it out quite.
That's right. The notch on one of the edges are where the two sides come together. That's actually from my point of view, a more minor feature. There's also a potential cavity above the entrance, not the entrance that people walk through, but the original entrance. Small. When I say small, we're still talking about many meters, but there's a cavity there. So I think the bottom line is that there are structures or cavities or chambers potentially, when I say potentially, I think the evidence is very good, in the Great Pyramid that we did not know about before these studies, because there's no passages directly to them that are open at the moment. So probably the best way to confirm this physically, is to try to maybe drill into them, that type of thing. But that would be not an easy task. Plus,
not with Zahi Hawass
the Egyptians don't necessarily want drilling into the Great Pyramid. One can understand why.
Yeah. Well, I know it's not your work, but I just am so excited by Katie's paper on the NCGR, whom we had on our show a number of times, the National Council for Geocosmic. Can you tell us
Geocosmic Research? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the premise of her paper? Does water bearer bring forth a river of fire?
Okay, so let me see if I can explain it well, and she can maybe listen and tell me if I'm not. Essentially, Aquarius is the water bearer. It's considered a water bearer in the sense that it's pouring water, but astrologically it is not a, quote, water sign. It is an air sign. And this air sign, well, what is it doing pouring water? Well, this is not water in the sense of H2O. It is not water that we think of. It's cosmic waters, which I'm speaking for myself, would call plasma, electrically charged particles. It's a stream of plasma, and we're finding that the universe is mostly plasma. And in fact, all the planets, the stars, the solar systems out there, the galaxies, they are all connected by these streams of plasma. And plasma, and so what we're really talking about is a river of fire, if you would, or a river of charged particles, plasma conduits, and plasma in some cases hitting planets, including Earth. So it's really that type of connection that we're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're about out of time.
I hope I explained that correctly. But yeah, I would encourage everyone to go to our website, robertschoch.com, S-C-H-O-C-H, Robert, S-C-H-O-C-H.com, and they will see her article there.
Good going. This has been a great thrill for me tonight. I am so glad we had time to do this together, and I look forward to getting together with you another time. Bye-bye, sir.